The morning my water stopped working, I thought my well pump had finally given up. I walked into my kitchen half asleep, turned the faucet, and heard nothing but a dry clicking sound. What I didn't know at that moment was that my neighbors had made a decision that would end up costing them thousands of dollars. They thought cutting off my water would force me to follow their rules. They didn't realize they were about to teach me the most expensive lesson their entire neighborhood had ever learned. My name is Caleb Turner. I'm 46 years old, and I own a 40-acre piece of land outside Brett Hollow, Colorado. I bought that property 12 years before anyone even talked about building a subdivision next to me. Back then, there was nothing around except open fields, old fence lines, dirt roads, and enough quiet to hear the wind moving through the grass at night. That was exactly why I bought it. I wasn't looking for a neighborhood. I wasn't looking for fancy houses, and I definitely wasn't looking for an HOA telling me how to live. I wanted space. I wanted a place where I could raise cattle, repair equipment, and wake up every morning knowing the only person responsible for my land was me. My grandfather used to tell me that land was one of the few things left in life where a person could still build something that belonged to them. I carried that idea with me when I signed the papers and took ownership of those 40 acres. For years, everything was peaceful. I had my small cattle operation, a few old barns, and a routine that most people would probably call boring. But honestly, I loved it. There's something satisfying about fixing a broken fence before sunrise or watching a herd settle down after a long day in the pasture. Then, about 4 years after I bought the property, a development company showed up. They weren't rude. They weren't trying to push me around. In fact, the first time their project manager, Nathan Brooks, came to my gate, he was actually respectful. He explained they were building a residential community on the land bordering mine, and they needed to run a water supply line through a small section of my property because of the elevation. He said, "Caleb, we're not asking you to give up your land. We just need an easement so the line can cross underneath your property." I looked over the plans, talked to an attorney, and eventually agreed. The agreement was simple. They could run the water line through the designated area. They would pay me a small monthly access fee, and I would maintain control over everything located on my land. It seemed fair. For more than a decade, nobody had a problem. The neighborhood grew, houses went up, families moved in, and honestly, I was happy for them. I wasn't against development. I wasn't some guy sitting on a hill angry at progress. If people wanted to build homes and raise families nearby, that was their choice, as long as they respected mine. The problem started when the original developer sold the community and a new HOA board took over. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. I remember opening it while standing beside my mailbox with a cup of coffee in my hand. I thought it was some kind of mistake because the letter had my address on it but was written like I was one of their residents. It said my cattle operation was creating an undesirable visual impact and that I needed to move my livestock farther away from the shared property line. I actually laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because it was unbelievable. I wasn't inside their neighborhood. I wasn't part of their HOA. I didn't sign their rules. I called their office and explained that politely. The woman on the phone said, "Mr. Turner, we're just trying to protect property values." I said, "I understand that, but your property values don't give you control over my property." I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A week later, another letter came, then another. They complained about the appearance of my barns. They complained about the cattle being too visible from their backyards. They even suggested that I consider modernizing my operation to better match the community atmosphere. That phrase stuck with me because it told me exactly what they thought. They didn't see my land as working property. They saw it as an empty space they wanted to control. I ignored the letters because I knew arguing with people who already believed they had authority over me was pointless. But the HOA board didn't stop. They escalated. And eventually, they made the one mistake they couldn't undo. The next few weeks felt like a strange battle where I was the only person who actually knew there was a war happening. I wasn't out there looking for a fight. I was still doing the same things I had done for years, feeding cattle, repairing equipment, and keeping my property running. But every time I checked the mailbox, there was another reminder that the HOA board wasn't going to let this go. They had convinced themselves that I was the problem, that my land was somehow an inconvenience simply because it didn't fit the picture they had created for their perfect little community. Then came the morning, everything changed. I woke up early, like I always did, made coffee, and walked into the kitchen expecting the normal routine. I turned the faucet handle, waited for the water pressure to build, and nothing happened. At first, I honestly thought it was just a mechanical issue. Maybe the pump failed. Maybe a pipe froze. Maybe something underground had finally broken after years of use. But after checking the system, I realized something was different. This wasn't a random failure. Someone had intentionally shut off the valve connected to the shared water line, and that valve was located on my property. I stood there looking at it for a few seconds, almost trying to convince myself I was misunderstanding what I was seeing, because there is a big difference between someone sending annoying letters and someone walking onto your land to turn off your water. One is arrogance, the other is a line crossed. I called the HOA office first, because I wanted to give them a chance to explain themselves. The HOA president at the time was a man named Richard Hale. He was a kind of person who always sounded like he was giving a speech, even when he was just answering a phone call. When he picked up, I asked a simple question. "Richard, did someone from your association access my property and shut off the water valve?" There was a pause, not a confused pause, a pause from someone who already knew the answer. Then he said, "Caleb, we are simply trying to resolve a compliance issue." I remember sitting there silently for a moment because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "A compliance issue?" I said. "You mean the rules I never agreed to follow?" He responded. "Sometimes neighbors have to make reasonable adjustments for the greater good." That sentence told me everything I needed to know. In his mind, my rights were an obstacle. My property was just something standing in the way of what they wanted. I told him that shutting off someone's water wasn't a negotiation tactic. It was a serious mistake. He laughed slightly and said, "Maybe now you'll understand how important cooperation is." That was the moment I stopped trying to reason with him. I hung up the phone and called someone who actually understood property law. That afternoon, I met with an attorney named Laura Mitchell, a real estate lawyer who had handled easement disputes for years. I brought every document I had, including the original agreement from when the subdivision was built. She read through everything quietly while I sat across from her waiting for a reaction. After several minutes, she looked up and said, "Caleb, did they really shut this valve themselves?" I told her yes. She leaned back and tapped the paperwork with her finger. "They may have just created a much bigger problem for themselves than they realize." She explained that easements are not just about giving someone permission to use part of your property. They are legal agreements with specific boundaries. And in my case, the original document contained a section that clearly explained access rights and interference. Paragraph 6 stated that any unauthorized interference with the water system or access points located on the property owner's land would be considered a material breach of the agreement. In simple terms, the people who depended on that water line had also agreed that they couldn't use it as a weapon against me. Laura looked at me and said, "They thought they were applying pressure. What they actually did was violate the one agreement protecting their access." I didn't celebrate. I wasn't excited about turning off water to families who had nothing to do with the HOA board's decisions. That part bothered me. The people living in those houses weren't the ones sending letters. They weren't the ones making demands. But at the same time, I couldn't allow someone to walk onto my property and use essential services as a way to force me into submission. There had to be consequences. Laura helped me send a formal notice explaining the breach and my intent to exercise my rights under the agreement. The HOA ignored it. They assumed I was bluffing. Richard even left me a voicemail saying, "You really don't want to take this direction, Caleb. There are 137 homeowners here, and you're going to make yourself look like the villain." That message stayed with me because it showed exactly how they were thinking. They believed numbers gave them power. They believed because they represented 127 houses, one person couldn't stand against them. They forgot something important. Property rights don't become weaker just because more people disagree with them. The following morning, I walked out to the valve. I looked across the hills toward the neighborhood they had built. Beautiful houses, fresh landscaping, expensive vehicles parked in driveways. From the outside, everything looked perfect, but behind those walls was a group of people who thought they could pressure someone simply because they had more voices. I put my hand on the valve and thought about everything that had happened over the past month. The letters, the demands, the disrespect. Then I turned it, slowly, quietly, no cameras, no crowd, no dramatic speech. Just a simple action backed by a document they should have read before they tried to use my own land against me. Within hours, the first calls started coming in. By sunset, the entire subdivision knew there was a problem. And by the next morning, Wonderstesum homes were waking up to the same thing I had experienced days earlier. No running water. By sunrise, my phone wasn't just ringing, It was exploding. Messages, missed calls, voicemails. Even a few neighbors I had never spoken to before were suddenly trying to reach me. At first, I expected anger. I expected people to call me every name in the book, because from their perspective, Wunschestasm homes had just lost their water overnight, and I understood why they were upset. If I had woken up that morning and couldn't take a shower, make coffee, or get ready for work because of someone else's dispute, I probably would have been frustrated too. But the more people learned about what actually happened, the more the story started changing. They realized this wasn't some random neighbor being difficult. This wasn't a man trying to hurt a community. This was a situation that started because the HOA board believed they could force someone outside their association to follow rules he never agreed to. Later that morning, Richard Hale finally showed up at my gate. This was the same man who had sounded so confident over the phone, the same man who told me I would eventually understand the importance of cooperation. But the person standing in front of me now looks completely different. The confidence was gone. The polished HOA president image was gone. He looked like someone who had just discovered that the shortcut he took had led him straight into a wall. He stepped out of his truck with 2 other board members behind him and immediately started raising his voice. "Caleb, this has gone way too far. You cannot shut down water service to an entire neighborhood because you're upset." I looked at him through the gate and said, "Richard, this didn't start because I was upset. It started because you walked onto my property and turned off my water because you didn't like how I used my own land." He tried to interrupt me, saying they were only trying to protect the community, protect property values, and maintain standards. But by that point, those words didn't mean much anymore, because protecting a community doesn't mean controlling people who aren't part of it. Maintaining standards doesn't mean changing the rules for someone who never signed them. I told him, "You keep talking about your community, but you forgot there was another person living right next to it." That sentence seemed to hit harder than anything else I said, because the truth was, I wasn't against them. I never had been. I didn't care about their landscaping, their houses, or their neighborhood meetings. I just wanted them to understand that my fence line was not the beginning of their authority. It was the end of it. Richard threatened to call the sheriff, and honestly, I told him that was fine. I wasn't hiding anything. I had the agreement. I had the paperwork. I had spent years making sure every decision involving my property was handled correctly. When the sheriff arrived, he listened patiently while Richard explained his side of the story. Then, he listened to me. Then he took the easement agreement and read through it carefully. The entire mood changed when he reached the section about unauthorized interference. After a few minutes, he looked at both of us and said, "This appears to be a civil matter. You're going to need lawyers, not law enforcement." Richard looked confused, almost offended. He'd expected someone in uniform to tell me I was wrong. Instead, he was reminded that documents matter more than confidence. The sheriff handed the papers back and walked away. That was the moment Richard realized this wasn't going to be solved by intimidation. The next 2 days were probably the most chaotic days that neighborhood had ever experienced. The HOA emergency phone line was overwhelmed. Residents were flooding the board's email inbox. People who had never attended a single HOA meeting were suddenly demanding answers. They wanted to know why their leadership had made such a huge decision without understanding the agreement that controlled their own water supply. Inside the emergency meeting, things got even worse for the board. The room was packed. Homeowners stood shoulder to shoulder, frustrated and confused. Richard tried explaining that the situation had been caused by a property dispute, but nobody cared about excuses anymore. They wanted accountability. One homeowner stood up and asked, "Did you personally authorize someone to go onto his land?" Another asked, "Did you even read the easement before you made this decision?" The room went quiet because everyone knew the answer. They hadn't. They had assumed. They assumed because they represented 127 homes. They had more power than one person. They assumed because they had an HOA title. Everyone around them had to listen, and that assumption had just cost them. By the 3rd day, the pressure became too much. Richard resigned as HOA president, not because I demanded it, not because I celebrated it. He resigned because the people he claimed to represent no longer believed he was protecting them. A few days later, the new interim president, Denise Carter, arrived at my property. She was completely different from Richard. There was no attitude, no lecture, no attempt to make me feel like I was the problem. She walked to my gate holding a folder and simply said, "Mr. Turner, I think both sides need to admit where things went wrong." That was the first time someone from the HOA had spoken to me like an equal. Inside the folder was a certified check for $34,000 to cover the damages and costs caused by the unauthorized shutdown. There was also a formal written apology from the board, but the most important document was the new easement agreement. This time, everything was clear. No vague language, no assumptions, no room for anyone to twist the rules. The agreement gave the neighborhood continued access to the water line, but it also recognized my rights as the property owner. It included a 20-year term, a $1,500 monthly access payment, and a 3% annual increase. I spent several days reviewing every page because I wasn't going to make the same mistake they made. I wasn't going to assume. I wasn't going to trust someone else's interpretation. I was going to know exactly what I was signing. When I finally signed the agreement, I walked back out to the valve and restored the water. It was a simple action, but it felt like the end of a very long argument. Within hours, water started flowing through the neighborhood again. Families could shower, restaurants could reopen, people could get back to their normal routines. And strangely enough, the first thing I felt wasn't victory, it was relief. Because the truth was, I never wanted those families to go without water. I never wanted a war with my neighbors. I just wanted the people in charge to understand that respect has to go both ways. After that day, everything changed. The letters stopped. The complaints about my cattle disappeared. Nobody from the HOA ever told me how to run my land again. The same people who once called my property an eyesore suddenly seemed to understand that it was a working ranch, not an empty piece of land waiting to become part of their neighborhood. And every month, when their HOA collected dues, part of that money went toward the agreement that they should have respected from the beginning. Sometimes I still drive past those houses with a cup of coffee in my hand and think about how different things could have been if they had simply knocked on my door and had a conversation, instead of trying to force me into compliance. The entire conflict could have ended with a handshake. Instead, it became a lesson that cost them thousands of dollars and a lot of embarrassment. But maybe that's the part people forget about property disputes. They're rarely just about fences, water lines, or paperwork. They're about respect. They're about whether people believe rules apply equally to everyone or only to the people they think they can control. And that's the question I want to leave you with. Do you think I was right to shut off the water after they interfered with my property? Or do you think there was another way I should have handled it? Where do you think the line should be between protecting a community and controlling someone else's life? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because I know this one is going to divide people. Some will say I went too far. Others will say the HOA got exactly what it deserved. Either way, that's what makes stories like this interesting. They force us to ask where fairness actually begins and where control finally ends. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more real-life property battles, HOA conflicts, and moments where one overlooked detail in a contract changes everything.